The moment Mark asked for my call sign, I watched a man who'd spent 30 years inside America's most classified operations set down his fork like it had turned to lead. He didn't ask twice. He didn't need to. My brother-in-law kept smiling that easy, superior smile he'd worn all through dinner, completely unaware he'd just walked into a room he didn't understand. I said one word, and the temperature at that table dropped 10 degrees. I hadn't planned on any of it. I'd shown up to my in-laws' house in a plain sweater and jeans, carrying a bottle of wine and the kind of tired that comes from 3 back-to-back watch rotations, hoping for a quiet meal and an early night. My husband Daniel had warned me his brother would be there. He always said it the same way, half apology, half bracing himself. Mark Whitfield had a gift for making every room about Mark Whitfield, and family dinners were his favorite stage. He was already holding court when we walked in, bourbon in hand, recounting some training exercise off the Virginia coast, like he'd personally turned the tide of a war. Mark was a lieutenant, surface warfare, and to his credit he'd worked for it. But somewhere along the way, hard work had curdled into something else, a hunger to be seen as the family's real success story, the one who'd traded a soft civilian life for something dangerous and honorable. He needed a foil. For years, without ever asking my permission, I'd been that foil. I never talked about my work, not because I enjoyed the mystery, though some nights the silence was almost restful. I simply couldn't. 14 years, and most of what I'd done didn't belong to me to tell. It belonged to the men and women who'd trusted me with their lives, in rooms with no windows, on ships that didn't officially exist in certain waters on certain nights. So when people asked, I gave them the truthful, unsatisfying answer. Administrative work, logistics, nothing exciting. It cost me nothing to let them believe it. Or so I thought. Dinner went the way it always did. His mother fussing over the roast, his father pouring wine like he was rationing gold, Mark working the table like a promotion board. Tonight's material was a joint exercise he'd just returned from, and he told it well, I'll admit. People leaned in. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table, the small apologetic gesture he always made when his brother got going. Then Mark's eyes drifted to me, sitting quiet near his father's old friend, a broad-shouldered man with silver hair, and the stillness of someone who'd spent a career learning not to move unless it mattered. Mark smirked. You're in the Navy too, right? Let me guess. You've never even been on a real mission. The table laughed. That easy, complicit laugh families give the loudest voice in the room. I just smiled and reached for my water. That's when the old man at the head of the table lifted his eyes. He'd been quiet all evening, the kind of quiet that isn't absence but attention. He set down his fork, looked at me, really looked, the way you look at someone when a piece of memory is trying to surface, and asked, out of nowhere, "What's your call sign?" Something in my chest went still. Not fear. The strange vertigo of 2 separate lives touching in a room where they were never supposed to meet. "Widowline," I said. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. He just set his fork down against the plate with a small, deliberate click, the sound of a door quietly closing on Mark's version of the evening. Mark's laugh died in his throat. Nobody else understood what had happened, why the air had changed. He recovered with another joke that landed flat, but something had shifted, and even he could feel it. The call came the next morning, a Virginia number I didn't recognize. Some old instinct told me to step onto the back porch before answering. "Commander Whitfield, this is Walt Reyes. We met last night." He didn't waste time on pleasantries. Reyes had spent 3 decades as a Command Master Chief attached to Naval Special Operations, the kind of career that doesn't show up on a resume, because most of it never officially happened. He told me, carefully, that he'd recognized something in my voice the moment I answered his question, not the call sign itself, but the practiced reluctance of someone trained to give up information only when it served a purpose. "You were with Task Group 9, he said. It wasn't a question. "I can't confirm assignments, Master Chief." "I know," he said, something warm in it. "I just wanted you to know I understood exactly who I was sitting across from." We talked a little longer, carefully, the way 2 people talk when they share a language, Most people around them have never learned. And somewhere in that careful dance I felt something unexpected: relief. For years I'd carried the particular loneliness of being fully known by almost no one, walking through my own family's holidays as a kind of half-person, present but invisible. "Widowline," he said again, almost to himself, before we hung up. I heard stories, didn't expect to be passing the mashed potatoes to her. Inside, Daniel watched me through the kitchen window, his expression unreadable in the way it got, whenever my other life brushed against our ordinary one. He didn't ask who'd called. 11 years of marriage had taught him exactly which questions I could answer and which I couldn't. It was one of the quiet reasons I loved him. He never made me choose between honesty and honor. He just waited on his side of the line. Mark, of course, was not so restrained. He told the story of that dinner all over town, to his buddies at the base, to his fiancée's parents, recasting the moment as some old man's confusion. Some guy got confused, he laughed it off. But David suspected his brother had spent more than a few hours turning it over in private. A few weeks later, Daniel told me Mark had invited us to the Navy Heritage Gala, a formal affair with admirals and dress whites, the kind of event where careers get measured against each other over champagne. Mark had never invited me to anything like it before. I understood exactly why he was doing it now. "He wants people to see the difference," Daniel said carefully, "between his life and yours." "Tell him we'll be there," I said. The ballroom smelled like polished brass and orchids. Mark found us within minutes, resplendent in his whites, working the room like a job interview that never ends. He steered a cluster of junior officers toward us. "This is my sister-in-law," he said, clapping my shoulder like I was a display piece. "Navy too. Mostly office work, though. Paperwork, scheduling." The group nodded politely. I let it sit. I'd spent too many years being underestimated to feel any sting in it. Then the room shifted. Not loud, just a ripple, heads turning toward the entrance with the deference reserved for rank. A rear admiral had arrived, silver-haired, the kind of presence that didn't need to raise its voice. His eyes swept the room and stopped on me. He crossed the floor directly, cutting past the base commander with an outstretched hand, past the senior staff gathering near the stage, straight to us. Commander Whitfield, his grip was firm, familiar. "Good to see Widowline again." The name landed in that room like a dropped glass. Junior officers exchanged glances. Someone near the bar turned fully around. Mark froze mid-sip, the drink halfway to his mouth, the practiced ease draining out of him. "Admiral," I said, keeping my voice even. "Good to see you too." He held my hand a beat longer than protocol required. "Heard you'd transferred stateside. Didn't expect to run into you at a gala." He glanced at Mark and Daniel, taking in the resemblance without needing an introduction. Then, low enough to feel private, and loud enough to be heard, "The Navy doesn't forget what you did out there, Commander. Neither do I." Then he was gone, swallowed back into the current of the room. Mark stood there, glass forgotten, staring at the space where the Admiral had been, then at me, like a man trying to reconcile two versions of a story that couldn't both be true. The days that followed had a strange, undecided weather to them. Mark didn't call. He didn't bring it up at the next family dinner, though I caught him watching me across the table, doing math he didn't like the answer to. It didn't last. Mark wasn't built for uncertainty. He was built for control. A week later, Daniel told me his brother had started asking quiet questions, to friends at the Pentagon, to an old classmate in personnel records, fishing for anything on a lieutenant commander named Sarah Whitfield. He found nothing. Every inquiry ran into the same wall. Task Group 9 returned a name and a redacted summary. Requests for more came back with one line: "Access denied." Even his classmate told him flatly that whatever I'd been part of sat several levels above his clearance, and that pushing further might draw exactly the kind of attention he didn't want. "He thinks you're exaggerating," Daniel told me one night, "or that people are just being polite because of who you're married to." I wasn't surprised. Mark had built his whole identity on being the family's proof of courage, the one who'd traded comfort for consequence. Admitting that the woman he'd spent years dismissing might have done more than he ever had wasn't a truth he could simply absorb. So he dug in, telling relatives the Admiral's greeting was just an old man's courtesy, that widow line was probably some minor call sign blown out of proportion. A few nodded along, relieved to have a simpler story. I let him have it. There was no version of confronting him that would have served anything but my own satisfaction, and satisfaction had never been the point. He forced the issue at his own engagement dinner, a polished room at the officers' club, more brass in attendance than expected for a private occasion. He waited until dessert, that was his style, letting the wine do half the work first. He stood, glass in hand, ostensibly to toast his fiancée, and turned to me instead. Before we get to the happy stuff, I think everyone deserves to know the truth. Sarah, why don't you tell everyone what you've actually done? No hiding behind classified, just tell them. The room went quiet in that particular way. Rooms go quiet when someone decides to turn a dinner into a trial. I can't do that, I said. You know I can't. Mark's smile went wide, triumphant. Exactly. That's what I'm saying. There's nothing to tell. It's always been a story. She works a desk job, folks. That's it. He laughed and lifted his glass, like he'd finally wrestled the narrative back into his own hands. I didn't defend myself. I never had. I simply held his gaze and let him have his moment, because a lie only holds as long as the silence around it stays undisturbed. The silence broke almost immediately. Near the entrance, a rear admiral I recognized from 3 separate briefings had just stepped up to the podium for the evening's toasts. He'd barely begun, something gracious about tradition, about service, when his eyes caught mine across the room, and the words simply stopped. He set down his notes and walked, unhurried, straight toward our table. Mark's glass hovered halfway to his lips. I watched the blood drain from his face, as he realized this was not going to go the way he'd planned. Commander Whitfield. The Admiral's voice carried across the silent room. He took my hand and held it a moment longer than protocol required, then turned to face everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know what's been said here tonight, but I want to say something myself. This officer has saved American lives more times than most of us in this room will ever know, in operations most of us will never be cleared to hear about. I've worked alongside Commander Whitfield on 3 separate occasions, and I can tell you with absolute certainty, there is no braver officer wearing this uniform tonight. The silence that followed was absolute. Mark sat frozen, his carefully built narrative collapsing in front of the exact audience he'd assembled to destroy mine. Someone near the back began to clap, and within seconds the entire room was on its feet. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. I nodded once, thanked him quietly, and sat back down. Daniel found my hand under the table and gripped it hard. News like that doesn't stay contained. By the following week the story had spread across the base, not through any effort of mine, but through the officers who'd been there. Daniel told me it started small. A lieutenant asking Mark at the gym what it was like being related to Widow Line. Mark laughed it off the first time, brushed past it the second. By the 4th mention, something in him had visibly begun to shift. The deeper unraveling came from a commander Mark deeply respected, who mentioned in passing that he'd once served alongside a task force led in part by an officer known only by a single call sign, and that the men in that unit still spoke of her with a reverence Mark had never once heard directed at himself. He hadn't said it to embarrass Mark, he'd said it because he assumed Mark already knew. Mark came to see me 2 weeks later, alone, without Daniel there to soften it. He showed up at my door on a Tuesday evening looking smaller than I'd ever seen him, the swagger gone. We sat at my kitchen table. I don't know what to say to you, he finally admitted. I spent years thinking I understood exactly where I stood compared to you. Turns out I didn't understand anything. I let the silence sit, the way I'd learned to sit in silences far heavier than this one. I've spent my whole life needing to be the one who did something, he said quietly, and I never once considered that the person I was competing with might have already done more than I could imagine, and just never felt the need to say so. Something softened in me I hadn't expected, not forgiveness yet, that would come later, on its own terms, but something adjacent to it. His apology, when it came in full, wasn't one dramatic sentence. It unfolded over weeks, a phone call just to ask how my week had gone, an offer to help Daniel fix the fence line, a quiet correction when a cousin made an offhand joke about desk jobs that Mark once would have laughed along with. The real moment came at another family dinner, the same table where his cruelest joke had once landed. He stood partway through the meal, and this time his face wasn't wearing a performance. He turned to me directly. "I owe you an apology. Not just for that comment months ago. I've spent years making you smaller than you are, because it made me feel bigger than I was. I didn't know I was doing it, but I was." He paused. "I'm sorry for every time I made you shrink at your own family's table." I let the words settle before I answered. "I forgive you," I said, and meant it. "But respect isn't earned by talking about what you've done. It's earned by staying quiet after you've done it." He nodded slowly, and I watched the words land somewhere real. Around the table, everyone was watching us differently now, not the charged silence of the gala or the engagement dinner, but something gentler. Daniel reached over and took my hand, the same gesture he'd made 100 times, but lighter now, no longer carrying the weight of a secret, only the two of us protected. His parents watched with a quiet pride I hadn't seen before. Even Mark's fiancée offered me a small, warm smile from across the table. Mark lifted his glass, and this time there was nothing performative in it at all. "To my sister-in-law," he said, his voice steady, "the bravest sailor I've ever met." Glasses rose around the table, a soft chorus of agreement. I didn't need the toast. I want to be honest about that. I'd built a life that never depended on anyone's recognition, but there is a particular quiet grace in finally being understood by the people who share your table, even when you never asked them to. Nobody asked me how many missions I'd been on, or what Task Group 9 had really done, or what Widow Line had meant to the people who'd once depended on it. They didn't need to anymore. They'd learned, the hard way families sometimes do, that some of the strongest people you'll ever know are the ones who never needed you to know it.